Hello, everyone. This is Pastor Rick Sewell with Union Hill Baptist Church, welcoming you to the broadcast of our Sunday service for June the 7th, 2020. Miss Heather Sloan will be introducing us into worship with the song Shout to the Lord. And then the Sunday sermon will be from the book of Proverbs, the 17th chapter, the 27th and the 28th verses. And the title of the sermon is Words Say a Lot. We hope that you are blessed by this service.
My Jesus, my Savior, Lord, there is none like you. All of my days, I want to praise the wonders of your mighty love. My comfort, my shelter, tower of refuge and strength. Let every breath, all that I am, never cease to worship you. Shout to the Lord, all the earth, let us sing. Power and majesty, praise to the King. Mountains bow down and the seas will roar at the sound of your name. I sing for joy at the work of your hands. Forever I'll love you, forever I'll stand. Nothing compares to the promise I have in you. Nothing compares to the promise I have in you.
It is so good to be back with you. I'm going to be looking at one of my favorite verses or a couple of my favorite verses from the book of Proverbs in just a few moments. But my sermon this morning is entitled, Words Say a Lot. Your words say a lot. The flavor of your words say a lot. The tone of your words, the character of your words. Have you ever been recorded? Have you ever listened to your own voice and went, who's that? Did you do that after such a beautiful song? It is surprising. In fact, one of the exercises, anytime I get to work with a young preacher who's kind of in his training phase, I challenge them, record yourself, make an audio recording of yourself, make a video recording of yourself in my home somewhere. You know, you've all got those places in your home where things have been stored beyond living memory. But I have boxes and boxes of cassette tapes. Used to go back and review those just to hear how badly I mangle the language. Sometimes I catch myself, even as I'm talking, going, you shouldn't be doing that. Those moments when you're moving from one thought to the other. Language is interesting to me right now. If you can wonder what I've been doing for the last 30 hours. We went and picked up that little special fellow on Friday evening. Donna had to work Friday this week, and usually she has Friday off, so we would pick up Corbin on Thursday evening and have him Friday, Saturday, and by Sunday we are exhausted. But we picked him up Friday evening, brought him home. By the time we got home, it was bedtime anyway. He went straight to bed. So yesterday was our day. And of course, I do believe he is the cutest grandchild that has ever walked the face of this planet. But we've got some competition. But he's learned to talk. And when I say he's learned to talk, the child never stops talking. Half the time we don't understand it because there's still some baby speech, but at times he articulates so clearly and he repeats everything. I wish I could have had my video camera ready on my phone. We meet them halfway there at the state line on Highway 29. Just after you enter North Carolina, there's a rest stop there. And they got there before we did, and we pulled up, and he's dancing, and he's going, I'm so excited, Grandma, Grandma, Grandma. He gets excited when we get home for Papa because Papa runs the tractor, but that's a different thing. All these things that he says, every time we see him, 2, 3, 4 weeks between visits, we're amazed at how his language progresses. And sometimes when he's not there, Donna and I we will talk Corbin talk to each other. I do it. All those little things that he says. And we are so pleased that already he's learning. I want juice, he'll say, or my favorite is when he wants his milk at bedtime. I want milk. Is it hot? You have to warm his milk. But when you hand him something, thank you. How many people do you meet during the course of a daily conversation, the course of your daily activities, and you wonder, I wonder if they would understand what they sound like if I could just record them. In fact, I've been known to record people when they weren't knowing it and play it back to them, but I've not done that to any of you. I want you to understand the wonder of words, the artistry, not the artistry of an orator, someone who spends a good part of their life practicing the creativity of communicating to others, but the artistry of a well-spoken word, or the tragedy of a poorly spoken word or phrase. Perhaps you've been there. Or perhaps you know someone whose motto for life is something like this. Well, God knows everything you're thinking, so if you think it, might as well say it. If that has ever entered your mind, let me just say, just because you think it doesn't mean you ought to say it. In fact, the first 3 things you think of might be the first three things that you should not say, because words are complicated. I am amazed at how the news media has emphasized, I'm thinking of how best to say this, they have emphasized a media mindset is, I don't want to just hear what you have to say, but I want to catch that one thing that wasn't perfect. I want to see if I can trip you up. I want to see if I can take what you say and twist it in such a way that I have a story now that speaks of scandal. Remember this week, I enjoy sports. So we have kind of had a dry season through all of this. But I still turn on the sports channel in the morning when I get up and am working on my coffee. And I heard this week of an NFL quarterback who was a fine Christian gentleman, Drew Brees, quarterback of the the New Orleans Saints. New England's a whole different thing. And he was issuing an apology for something he'd said. Drew Brees? And if you haven't followed the story, a day or two earlier, someone was interviewing him and they asked about the athletes who take a knee during the flag. And he said, well, I just have such a love for my country. I can't understand and don't respect anyone who would disrespect the flag. In just about any other setting, that is a fairly, not everybody would agree with it, but it is a fairly safe thing to have said. But in light of what's going on for the last 2 weeks, suddenly, certain people latched onto it and made a complicated issue. And he had to backtrack and say, it was never my intent to hurt people. And some people felt a bit hurt by that. I simply use that to illustrate the reality that words can be complicated. As can be the situation when others are using words. Dad, I may have told this here, but in the town where I spent about 20 years, Pilot Mountain, North Carolina, there is a restaurant that literally is about from the piano to the organ. Its name is Willard and Wilmoth Sandwich Shop, but nobody knows it by that. The reason I know it is my younger brother worked there for a couple of years. It was known as the Squeeze Box. It's a little trailer with 10 or 11 seats, and the news of Pilot Mountain is all exchanged in those 10 seats. You can hear anything and you will hear everything that goes on, from big issues, national issues, to local issues, to personal issues. In fact, I have to tell this to illustrate just how personal it can get. We had a visiting preacher from Detroit, Michigan, back in 1993. And we took him to see small town dining at its best. It's a greasy spoon, hamburgers and hot dogs. But the girl that worked behind the counter, who later would become a member of the church that I started to pastor that same year, she is in the Squeeze Box, and 2 months ago she had had a baby. And someone was in there who hadn't heard the discussion, and she begins to explain how she was actually working one day, and while she was working in the little sandwich shop, her water breaks. And here we have a guy from Detroit who's sitting there going, I can't believe they're talking about this. That's the nature of the thing. Dad is there one day. He's ordered his little sandwich, and he said, I heard two people who were rehearsing something or discussing something that had gone on at the church. And he said, I knew what was going on. And by their conversation, he said they didn't. But they were talking about it very authoritatively, they thought. And Dad said, I was just about to open my mouth and correct them, to use his language. And he said, I thought better of it and just put my hot dog in my mouth and just ended that. Language can be such a complicated issue. I want us to realize that in a country that celebrates the freedom of speech as a constitutional right, we have failed altogether to emphasize what I think is the correlation that goes along with the freedom of speech, and that is the responsibility of speech. We have a moral responsibility for what we say, for when we say it, and for how we say it. With that in mind, I'd like to read just 2 verses from the wonderful book of Proverbs, and these verses actually form a couplet. They are intended to go together, although they can be taken, there's a lot of ground that we can cover by taking them apart. But chapter 17 of the book of Proverbs, verses 27 and 28. The one who has knowledge uses words with restraint, and whoever has understanding is even-tempered. Even fools are thought wise if they keep silent, and discerning if they hold their tongues. Now, we don't get the poetic nature of this. It's, you know, how poetry works in couplets. Roses are red, violets are blue, babies are pretty, and you are too. You know, I'm making it up. No, Carrie, I wasn't talking about you being pretty. But those verses only make sense when you take them together. Well, verse 27 and 28 are a couplet in the Hebrew language. And the first one has a real clear meaning. The less said often is the better. The second verse, actually, most people don't understand it. I have used this second verse in the upbringing of my boys. They had to memorize this verse. They had this verse quoted to them many times when they spoke what they shouldn't say. It sounds like the second verse is reinforcing the first one. Not at all. The first one said, use words with restraint. The wise person says less. Then the second one basically says, but a fool can look wise by being silent. So it's a very subtle way of saying, but the wise word should know when to speak, and at important times, they absolutely should speak. Even the fool is counted wise when he keeps silent. Or as the modern parallel of that would say, Better to be silent and be thought a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt. We want to look at these verses and emphasize what I think are some necessary truths that go along with them. And the first one, the book of Proverbs, all through it, celebrates the pathway of wisdom. It warns you against the pathway of foolishness. And in the use of language, in the use of communication, we need to recapture a respect for the pathway of wisdom. There is no virtue in letting every bird that flies between your ears fly out of your mouth. Every random thought. Have you ever been around someone? Sometimes, and I say this with no prejudice at all because I'm headed in that direction, but have you ever seen an old person who has lost all of the boundaries and anything they think, they say? Jimmy's laughing back there. He's got somebody in mind. Jimmy's saying he's already there. I've seen those kind of, I've visited in nursing homes. And sometimes, especially if someone has had a cognitive event, like a light stroke or something, they lose those social boundaries. And, I don't know what she was doing to her hair this morning, but she didn't fix it. And it gets worse and worse and worse. And of course, I'm not going to go there. But the thing I'm finding today is, in increasing measure, it's not those people who are in cognitive decline that sometimes say things that just slip into their head. I find that there are foolish things said everywhere, even in the pulpit. We've seen the reports of teachers who have said outrageous things at school. And dear Lord, don't let me get on the subject of politicians. And again, I am very careful not to diverge into left, right, one side or the other. But if there's ever been a time when both sides seem to be fighting to come out ahead in foolish language, I don't know if I've ever seen it worse. We glorify that kind of thing in the media. Our television shows, especially the ones of comedy and humor, make crass, rude, brash statements to be a form of entertainment. And we wonder then why, when people speak that way in public, that there is no outcry. There is no outrage. The book of Proverbs elevates wisdom as something to strive for in our lives, and yes, to strive for in our language. In fact, one of the theologians that I am so keen on following his writing, and now because of the internet, I can see videos of him because he's in England. I don't get the chance to see him here. And he made the comment once that when we see language break down, you're seeing a culture that is failing. And I thought, oh, what a powerful statement. I wanted to share with you a few other statements from the book of Proverbs. From 21:23 in the English Standard Version, whoever keeps his mouth and his tongue keeps himself out of trouble. Whoever takes hold of it, whoever learns that just because I think it doesn't mean I ought to say it. How many times could I illustrate when something came into my head and popped out of my mouth and I instantly wish I could reach out here and grab it and just take it back? One of the disciplines of life that must begin at a very young age is the discipline of controlling our mouth. That is the way of wisdom. James would tell you that the tongue is like a raging fire. It's like wild horses. It's filled with poison. Who can control it? One of the characteristics that we should emphasize in our life, in our being, in our personality, is the ability not to say everything that we sometimes think. Because our own words often get us into the most trouble. Chapter 15, verse 1. A soft answer turns away wrath. Or you could put it this way, a wise answer. It's speaking of the wise use of language. But harsh words stir up anger. Again, not being political. You would be shocked by my political inclinations, but that's okay. We're not going there. But we need to hold our leaders to a standard that we don't encourage anger. Anger eats away at us. Anger tears away the foundations that allows us to exist together. Anger puts that finger of accusation at everyone else, and suddenly you make everyone else the enemy, where love makes everyone else a partner. Soft answers can diffuse dangerous circumstances. And oh, how we need that. Now the faith side of it, James 1:26. If anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart by saying, I can say whatever I want, this person's religion is worthless. The lady I buried most recently was not a crude woman at all. But she, sometimes when you first met her, she actually came to me my first month at the church and said, now, you need to understand, I am known for speaking my mind. But she also practiced that discretion of knowing what to say, when to say it, and how to say it. But there were other people that was, I can't even repeat some of the things that was said. In fact, in my first church, we had a Sunday school teacher, a male Sunday school teacher, who had been there for 50 years, not a young man. And every pastor had had shock and outrage at some of the things he would say inside the Sunday school class. And I can't repeat any of it in mixed company. But I'm going to tell you, even you fellas that served in the military, and you've heard it all, you might blush just a little bit at some of those things. We need to learn that how we use our tongue is a reflection of how we surrender our heart. I love Ecclesiastes 7:8. The end of the matter is better than its beginning. Better to be slow to anger than hot-headed. If you remember in verse 27 of Proverbs 17, it said that the one who has knowledge uses words with restraint. And whoever has understanding is even-tempered. Or I would paraphrase it to say, learns to be even-tempered. One of the things that happens, this is a very interesting thing. I wish Drew were here, but they're traveling this morning to pick up the little fella, and they've got somewhere to go. But Drew was talking to me one time, and he said there is research that shows that when your anger level rises, and I'm not talking about the kind of, doggone it, I'm frustrated. I'm talking about that just seething anger. Your IQ literally drops by more than half. The madder you get, the dumber you are. Research has shown that. The scripture says that there is benefit in learning to be even-tempered. And research says that's exactly true. Those who lose their temper lose their mind. I used to think temporary insanity was the most idiotic of defenses until I saw the research that said when people truly have all the hormonal changes that happen in the body when adrenaline goes in and it hits the brain, whatever your brain was doing before, it stops doing it. We need to learn that there is great benefit in controlling especially that anger of emotion. And here's something that I had to learn, and I will repeat this many times. Nobody can make you angry. They can make a doggone good attempt at it. But anger is your choice at how to respond. If you're saying that, Judy, you can just make me so angry, what you're saying is, I'm a puppet and you have the strings and you can control my life. And when you do that, I'll guarantee you somebody will figure that out and they will pull your strings just to see you dance. And that person was me about 30 years ago. And when a man told me, maybe people don't make you angry, maybe you're just an angry person. And that hit me. I was in a crowd of people when he said it, but it hit me personally. And as I've studied the scriptures since that time, I learned that the Lord teaches us that there are a lot of things that are good, but one of the best things is to be slow to anger rather than to be hot-headed. I heard a guy one time talk about, I know my temper gets the best of me, but sometimes it just feels good to let her fly. But the damage that he left behind was always worse than what he started out with. The wise, Proverbs 14:16, the wise fear the Lord and shun evil, but a fool is hot-headed and yet feels secure. That's just the way I feel about it. You have to learn to deal with it. The arrogance of saying, just because I have a tension of emotions, I can take it out on anyone and everyone. Let me say this, you family people here. Especially you family people, you've all been there. You've worked a job, and on that job, you've probably had an idiot that you worked with or worked for. But you were polite to them. You're polite to the people out in public. And then we come home, and sometimes we drop our guard, and we dump on the person that is closest to us more than we do on anyone else. Bad idea. You are never safe from the damage of evil. And sometimes our words are used for such an evil thing. Proverbs 14:17, a man of quick temper acts foolishly, and a man of evil devices is hated. It just illustrates what I've just said. It's all through the scriptures. But there is more here. The quiet man holds it back, the latter half of that verse. A fool, been talking about the wisdom, a fool just lets it fly. A fool gives full vent to his spirit. One of the steps in growing wisdom is in learning what to say and what not to say. You've been there. You've been there when in a meeting, in a gathering, there's always one, and sometimes more. There's one who just has no shame at all in voicing every thought that they ever had. And in fact, they have the ability to raise their voice and kind of dominate other people. In one of my churches, y'all pardon me 1 second. I left my water down here. In one of my churches, I say my church, in a church I pastored before I was there, the pastor before me was military. He had spent some time in the military as an army chaplain. He had achieved the rank at that time of captain. The chairman of deacons was lifetime National Guard, Army National Guard. He was a light colonel, lieutenant colonel. Now, lieutenant colonel, well, about this tall, and army chaplain captain. Rank, physical height, all that together. And over here was James. So James, pastor, chair of deacons. Physical height. And the pastor had an agenda. I don't know what it was. I don't know what his idea was, but his idea was, we want to do something. So I'm going to pick on you. You get to be my example this morning. Not you. But during the course of the meeting, when James is there and said, I just don't see it that way, the pastor gets up and he leans over and he starts this stuff. Remember, he's a captain. And that lieutenant colonel, realizing this was getting out of hand, is going to be bad fast, he says, stand down, captain. Not stand down, captain, but Stand down, Captain. And red-faced, that pastor withdrew because he realized he had stepped way too far. But that military training told him there was an accountability. A fool gives vent to his spirit, but a wise man quietly holds it back. If you cannot say what needs to be said with control, with grace, with an even tone, you might need to bite your lip until you can. Then the second half, even fools are thought wise if they keep silent. Verse 28, and discerning if they hold their tongue. It is, as I told you, a challenge to, at certain times, being silent is insufficient. At certain times, your voice is needed. At certain times, a voice needs to be injected into the foolishness or the tension or the anger of a world situation that changes everything. I'm struggling to remember off the top of my head. I believe it was the former Soviet Union who in the 1980s shot down a passenger jet. They claimed that it had violated their airspace. They claimed that it was, espionage and on and on and on. And president at the time was Ronald Reagan. And when this thing unfolded, he was at his ranch out in California. And the news media are all saying, you need to get back into the White House. His own advisors called him and said, you need to leave the ranch and get there and make a statement. I've always respected the response he chose that day. He said, I really don't need to say a thing. Every person on this planet can see this exactly for what it is, a tragedy, a senseless killing, and I don't need someone else fanning the flames and making world tensions even worse. Let Psalm 19:14 from the New American Standard Bible, let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. It is a prayer to God. Lord, help me to say the thing that would be honoring to you. Help me to say the kind of things that would be pleasing to you, because I've got a lot of ideas about what I'd like to say, and some of them might not be good ideas. Let me start to learn to think in my mind in such a way that my words would be pleasing to you. Because there comes a time when we must speak out. There comes a time when we must voice even a dissension of opinion, lest others thought or think that they go unchecked. Proverbs 12:14, the New Living Translation, which I absolutely love. Wise words bring many benefits. I'm going to delay the description of some of those benefits to just a couple of minutes from now. But what we're doing, we're counteracting what was said. Wisdom says sometimes, verse 27, sometimes the best thing you can do is not say a thing. But if you've got to speak, choose your words wisely and reap the benefits thereof. It's worth your time. Sometimes that anger and expression allows us to get to the point quicker. Wise words carefully walk between the mines in the minefield and help us avoid danger. Proverbs 12:18, the words of the reckless, counteracting the last one, pierce like swords, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. How many circumstances could we talk about? I won't talk about any of them nationally because that's polarizing, but I love the conversations I'm able to have with my son Drew, who is a counselor. And he has people, sometimes they are individuals who come in, and they tell them, what's going on and the fallout from it. And he said, well, if someone said to you what you said to others, how would you feel? And they begin to realize that When my words are ill chosen, they cause damage. And when others simply help me to see the effect of my own choices, there is healing. Oh, when pain happens, when tension happens, when violence happens, we need to remember that our voices must not be silent, but our voices must seek healing and hope. Some of the challenges that go with wise words. Wise words should always deal in truth. And if you are a social media person, you are what the rest of the world calls clickbait. They love to put something on there that so interests you, you just got to click and follow it. One of my friends from many years ago, he put on there about all these people are protesting. He put a picture of the Lincoln Memorial up there, and it has been painted, and the Lincoln's head has been bashed in and all that stuff. There's only one problem. It's not true. Video editing is a wonderful thing, and it's a horrible thing. So many times, some people put bald-faced lies out there in so-called print, and we don't look to see if it's true. We act as if it is, and we magnify the damage. Wise words will seek to verify what you're talking about. Know the facts. Oh, I've heard some words. I've heard the coronavirus is no big deal. I've heard that it's just an excuse for certain people to take over. Now, let me say, do I think that some of the responses have kind of gone a bit far? Yes, I do. But having talked to some people who are in the hospitals holding people's hands when others are dying, we might need to back off of our rhetoric just a bit. Wise words not only deal in truth, wise words seek justice. And if there's anything that you and me, need to recognize that sometimes our circle of justice might have been just a bit small. If it doesn't affect me, I'm not too concerned about it. That's not justice. Until it's fair for everyone, it's really not fair for anyone. What you have in those unbalanced situations are people who take advantage and others who bear the cost. Wise words encourage justice, yes, on a global scale. Justice that applies to everyone. You know, I laugh at some of my religious peers right now. People that are higher up, you know, in terms of national politics, religious politics, and they talk about religious freedom. And in so doing, they destroy the freedom of other people. George Truett, I can say this with pride, he was born in North Carolina, pastored the First Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas for 7 years, something like that. In fact, when he resigned because of having cancer, the church declined his resignation, and in the late 1940s, he preached his last sermons over a telephone from the hospital bed. No video back then. And George Truett made a famous speech on the very steps of the Capitol building, and he spoke of the precious Baptist value of religious liberty, and that says we must be free to practice our religion, and if we're to give true religious liberty, we must ensure the freedom from religion if the people choose to take it. And oh, how people today don't want to hear those words. But he was understanding that a freedom for one must apply to others who would use it differently. Wise words speak true justice. And wisdom, or wise words, understands, friends, how to pick your battles. I don't have to correct everybody that doesn't toe the line. I don't have to correct people who make small errors. And that one gets me every time. Sometimes I just want to speak up and show you and demonstrate I have knowledge. And sometimes I just don't need to. In fact, I've learned to say something. I do this one in counseling. David, I'll pick on you. Say David comes to me and he explains an issue, and I go, well, maybe that's not, and David immediately says, yeah, but I'm going to do this. And then I just say, well, I wouldn't talk you out of being miserable. Not for anything. I don't need to contend. I don't need to prove somebody. If they want my advice, I'm glad to give it. But it's not my job to overcome them. Neither is it yours. Knowing how to pick your battles understands there's a difference between speaking in every occasion and listening. And we need to learn to listen. Some warnings that I would throw at you. Beware what I call sensationalism. That desire that so many people have to get attention. I have a friend in ministry who lost his job. He lost his job. He's in music ministry. I may have told you this. But he has a huge choir, and they are very talented. And in fact, a lot of people come to that church for the music above all else. And then Facebook hit. And posting your church services hit. And he would post the church music, and the pastor would post the sermon. Separate posts. Guess which posts got the most views? He lost his job because the preacher his ego was bruised because more people were making comments and clicking that they liked it and they loved it than they were about the sermon. The preacher's a friend of mine. That's why I'm not telling you his name. It's a guy that I love. And he can be boring behind the pulpit. But we love to speak when we think it'll get attention. We need to beware that hunger within ourselves to be in the center of others' attention. We need to also be very aware of the danger of what I call the bandwagon approach. There are people who, you can get a hot topic, and suddenly people who have never had an inkling that this was even an issue suddenly think they have so much to say about it because it feeds into that last one. It gets attention. So I'll just say what everyone else is saying, or I'll take it a bit further. Beware. I can do this. Any of you remember the little book, The Prayer of Jabez? Back in the 90s, it was so popular that you saw it on the shelves of Kmart and Walmart. And following that was another book called Secrets of the Vine. Just to be honest, the theology in them, it was very popular and it was very poor theology. I ran into a preacher friend of mine, and right in the middle of this is a rage. Everybody's talking about the prayer of Jabez. I asked him, his name was Gene. Gene, have you read this book yet? He said, no, I've not read it. I said, well, everybody's saying it's such a popular thing. He said, well, if it's popular, that tells me that might be something to avoid. And I've learned the wisdom of that. We need to learn that everything that's popular is not always what's healthy. And beware speech of self-indulgence. I need to get my view out there. My words will be important. I want to say it because it's on my mind and it's on my heart. And last, don't repeat everything you hear. There's a word for that. What is it? Oh, amen, she said. I thought you said another word is gossip. Have you ever known somebody that, in fact, they will get on the phone and try to find out the facts so that the next thing they do, they are making a Facebook post about it, or they're calling around telling everybody like they are in the know. Proverbs 11:13. He who goes about, or I could, in all fairness there, this one equally applies. He or she who goes about as a talebearer reveals secrets. But he who is trustworthy conceals a matter. That is related to this one, Proverbs 17:19. He or she who conceals a transgression seeks love. But he who repeats a matter separates friends. I have to be careful how I say this, but there are some people, how do we say this delicately, who just like to stir up the soup. And other ways of saying that. They don't accomplish anything, but they sit back and just love to see the trouble. That happened to me a few years ago. Had a older gentleman in the church that he liked to be seen. He was a good man. Now, don't get me wrong. He was a good man. But when I say older, he had gotten to the age where he couldn't hear and he mumbled. But he liked to get behind the pulpit. And I was going to be gone one week for vacation, and I was speaking to another guy. He kept saying, we'll handle it. We'll take care of it. And I knew what he was going to do. He was going to put that fella right up here. I said, look, people don't want to hear him up there because they can't understand him. And you know what he went? He went right over there and told him, preacher doesn't want you in the pulpit. That was the end of it, you know. And he would sit back and just grin. And the tension got so bad. I actually showed up at a sandwich shop in Winston-Salem one day, and I looked, and this is something I shouldn't tell you, but I'm pretty good at reading lips. And there sat that same man, and the guy that was so mad at me now had his back to me, and the guy said, here he comes. And I read his lips. Here he comes. Well, I knew what they were doing. He was taking everything that I had ever said and using it to stir the soup. I'm big enough to take it. Are you big enough to live it? Your Christian faith calls you to a different path and a better path. So, my sermon for you this morning, as we close, says just one thing. Be careful what you say. You could change that. Be careful how you say it. Be careful when you say it. Be careful where you say it. Because what you say, when, where, and how you say it, says so much about who you believe in. This morning, as Judy comes, we're going to offer some music of meditation. No call to come forward. We will continue to social distance for a time. But perhaps there is something that would challenge you in how you relate to your fellow man in the days to come. If that would be the case, perhaps you would talk to your Father as we meditate during this time. When our country is in such turmoil, it's a fair question. How can things be better? It may begin with people just like you, learning to be wise in how we use everything we say. Be those people. Change the world. May God bless each of you with his wisdom in a complicated and tense world. You are dismissed.